The summer of 1969 in Los Angeles shimmered with the kind of illusion that only Hollywood could sustain, a golden haze of fame, wealth, and artistic freedom. Where the hills above the city hid sprawling estates behind iron gates and manicured hedges, and for those living within that world, there was an unspoken belief that they were insulated from the dangers that existed beyond their circles. But beneath that surface, something darker had already taken root, something that would erupt with a level of violence so shocking that it would permanently scar the American psyche. Because what unfolded that August was not simply a crime spree.
It reflected the influence of an extreme belief system, shaped by a man who would later become one of the most widely discussed figures in modern criminal history.
A man whose power did not come from physical dominance or conventional authority, but from an eerie ability to manipulate minds, to dismantle identities, and reshape their thinking according to his own worldview. Over the years, he drifted through the margins of society, absorbing ideas from philosophy, music, and the counterculture of the era,
reshaping them into a belief system that placed himself at the center of an impending apocalyptic transformation. And by the late 1960s,
he had gathered a group of followers, mostly young, often disillusioned individuals searching for meaning, who would come to be known as the Manson Family, a name that in itself masked the true nature of their existence, because this was no ordinary communal living experiment.
As the sun sets, we release what no longer serves us. Feel the warmth of the earth beneath you and embrace this moment of stillness.
Through psychological manipulation and isolation from the outside world, their primary base, the remote and decaying Spahn Ranch, seemed almost symbolic in its desolation. A once functional movie ranch now reduced to a ghost of its former self, populated not by actors and film crews, but by a group of individuals, slowly losing their grip on conventional morality, as Manson filled their minds with apocalyptic visions he called Helter Skelter, a term he borrowed from a song by the Beatles but twisted into a prophecy of an imminent race war that he believed would plunge the United States into chaos.
A chaos he insisted his followers must help ignite. Within this belief system, violence was no longer an act of wrongdoing.
It was a necessary step toward what Manson framed as a cosmic destiny. And by August of 1969, that ideology was ready to be translated into action, in a way that would blur the line between calculated murder and ritualistic performance. Because on the night of August 8,
following the instructions of the group's leader, several members traveled toward a secluded hillside home, unaware of the lasting impact the night would have.
At a hillside residence in Los Angeles, a place that held personal significance for the group's leader, connected to unresolved disappointments and past ambitions in the music world. Yet on that particular night, the house was occupied by someone entirely different from the people the group had originally focused on.
She was in the final weeks of pregnancy and was surrounded by several close friends, all of whom had gathered together that evening.
While her husband was traveling overseas, what followed was not an event driven by personal conflict or immediate gain, but an act of orchestrated terror that unfolded with chilling detachment as the intruders first severed the property's phone line, isolating the house from the outside world,
and then moved inward, confronting the occupants with a cold, methodical brutality that seemed almost rehearsed, as if each movement had been dictated long before they arrived.
And as the violence escalated, it became clear that the goal was not just to kill, but to create a scene so shocking, so incomprehensible, its impact would be felt far beyond the boundaries of that home, and among those affected that night was a young visitor who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time.
A young man who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, his presence a stark reminder of the randomness that would come to define these crimes.
Because the victims themselves were not the true targets in Manson's mind. They were symbols, pawns in a larger narrative. When the killers finally left the house, they left behind not just devastation, but a message, scrawled in blood across the walls.
Words like pig that hinted at a motive yet revealed nothing concrete, adding an additional layer of mystery that would confound investigators and terrify the public.
Because this was not a crime that fit into any familiar pattern, and when the bodies were discovered the next morning, the reaction was immediate and intense. As news spread rapidly through Los Angeles and across the nation, turning the crime scene into a focal point of media attention and speculation.
With theories ranging from drug-related disputes to internal conflicts within Hollywood's elite circles.
As the city struggled to process what had happened, fear began to take hold, creeping into neighborhoods that had once felt secure. And for many, the idea that such violence could occur in one of the most affluent and seemingly protected areas of Los Angeles was deeply unsettling, because it suggested that no barrier, no gate, no security system, no level of fame could guarantee safety, But if the first night's events were shocking, less than 24 hours later, another major incident dramatically intensified public concern, as the group's leader once again urged those around him to carry out his plans. This time even accompanying them as they drove through the city in search of a new target, eventually selecting the home of Leno LaBianca and Rosemary LaBianca,
a couple who had no connection whatsoever to the previous victims, reinforcing the randomness that made these crimes so terrifying, because there was no clear pattern.
No obvious motive that could be anticipated or avoided. In this instance, Manson himself reportedly entered the house, subduing the couple before leaving his followers behind to complete the murders, an act that underscored his role not as a passive instigator,
but as an active architect of the violence, shaping the events while maintaining a degree of physical distance that would later become a central focus of the legal proceedings.
And once again, the crime scene was marked by messages written in blood, phrases like war and "A2 death to pigs," alongside a series of symbolic messages and misspelled words widely believed to be connected to the group's belief system, serving as both a recognizable mark and a deliberate message.
The declaration that these acts were part of something larger, something deliberate, even if its true meaning remained elusive to those outside the cult.
The immediate aftermath of the LaBianca murders saw Los Angeles gripped by a level of fear that bordered on hysteria, as residents armed themselves, installed additional security measures, and viewed strangers with heightened suspicion, while the media coverage intensified, amplifying the sense of unease and uncertainty.
Because the lack of clear answers only deepened the anxiety, creating an atmosphere where speculation thrived and trust eroded.
Despite the high-profile nature of the crimes and the intense public pressure to find those responsible, the investigation initially struggled to connect the dots, in part because the motives appeared so unconventional, so detached from typical criminal behavior that they defied standard investigative approaches.
It was only through a series of seemingly unrelated developments, routine law enforcement activity at the remote property,
that the truth began to emerge, revealing a narrative that was as disturbing as it was complex, compelling them to commit acts that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. When the case finally moved to trial, it became one of the most widely followed legal proceedings in American history, capturing the attention of a nation trying to understand what had taken place. And as the courtroom proceedings unfolded, the focus shifted beyond the events themselves, but also to the psychological dynamics that made those events possible, as prosecutors argued that his influence had become so powerful, while the defense worked to explain actions that appeared difficult to understand. His own behavior throughout the proceedings continued to draw attention.
His public appearances were marked by unpredictable behavior, symbolic expressions,
who seemed to exist outside conventional ways of thinking, yet whose influence had very real consequences. Ultimately, he and several members of the group were found legally responsible, bringing a legal resolution to the case. But the cultural and psychological impact of the murders extended far beyond the verdict,
because they came to symbolize the darker undercurrents of an era that had often been idealized for its messages of peace and unity.
And in doing so, they marked a turning point in American history, signaling the end of a certain kind of innocence. Even decades later, the story of the Manson family murders continues to resonate, not only because of the brutality of the crimes, but because of the unsettling questions they raise.
About influence, belief, and the capacity for individuals to be drawn into destructive ideologies.
And was not the physical act of violence itself, but the ability of one individual to shape the perceptions and actions of others to such an extent, a narrative that transformed ordinary people into instruments of terror, leaving behind a legacy that continues to haunt the collective imagination.
A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous forces are not those that strike from the shadows, but those that operate within the human mind,
quietly reshaping reality until the unthinkable becomes possible.